The Met Gala has brought an enormous amount of cash into the museum, which has supported the Costume Institute over a period of time and allowed them to stage a sequence of extraordinary exhibitions that people don't necessarily associate the Met Gala with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. All you see are these steps, after all. So what happens inside is not necessarily the main message. It sends a message to the world that museums are elite organizations, that it's the people, it's a kind of red carpet experience in a way, and that the what's exciting is culture that's produced for the very rich. I think the Met does many other things, by the way, that balances that. But if that becomes the main message and the main way in which a museum is known, then that's a problem.
Welcome to the Samsung Galaxy Tab S9 series, Jaipur Literature Festival. This is our podcast, Jaipur Bytes, and this episode is in collaboration with Ithiyasology. It's a part of a series called Histories. I'm Eric Chopra, your host, and I'm joined by none other than Luke Syson, an exemplary curator, currently the director of the Fitzwilliam Museum at Cambridge University, and also has a backdrop of many other museums, from the British Museum to the National Gallery to the Met to Victoria and Albert. And today we are going to sort of, take a deep dive into what really brought you into curation. What is it that spoke to you when you went to the museum for the first time, perhaps as a child, and thought this is where you want to be? So, Luke, what are your origins? How did you curate yourself to be a curator?
Well, first of all, can I say what a huge pleasure it is to be here and to be with you. I'm a London kid. I was brought up in the capital, surrounded by museums, a slightly shy child, and I immersed myself in the age of about 9 in Greek and Roman mythology. Those were the stories I enjoyed most. And my father had the bright idea of taking me to the British Museum and to the National Gallery to see these stories being played out visually and materially in the galleries there. And I have to say it was the National Gallery that caught my imagination at that moment. But I must admit that I had no idea then that it was possible to have a professional life within those museums. It was simply that I discovered then and through my teens that museums provided a kind of space, a haven, a place where your imagination could rove, where you could remove yourself to some degree from daily life, but at the same time allow the works of art and the objects from different historical periods to teach you about yourself.
Absolutely. And we were speaking about this, that, for so many, perhaps the idea of being a curator or working in a museum or collecting art and putting it together, it's sort of perceived to be a hobby. But you have done it, professionally for many years. And we were speaking about the museums that you worked at. So let's talk about that moment where you also realize that this is something that is very professionally sustainable.
So right at the beginning of my time deciding that art history was what I wanted to study and to pursue for the rest of my professional life, really, I was very lucky. I had that sort of revelation at the age of about 19. It was because I was in Florence, in Italy, and had the luck to meet an architectural historian who explained to me how the aesthetics and the engineering of a church in Florence, Santo Spirito, worked. And I understood for the first time that it was people who provided the information and the expertise that enhanced my enjoyment of these extraordinary places. That it wasn't just about aesthetics, that information enhanced pleasure. And I thought to myself at that point, how can I do this for others? And first of all, I thought, well, museum education, the team would be where I would go. And then I realized that I was perhaps a little too selfish, and I loved the contact with works of art themselves, that intimate contact. So I studied at the Courtauld Institute in London. I started a PhD there. I must admit, I found life in libraries a little lonely, and tried for a job at the British Museum in the Department of Coins and Medals, which was not where I expected to land up. And applying for the job of curator of portrait and commemorative and art medals within that team. And I think partly because I wasn't expecting to get the job, I was very relaxed and did in the interview process. So and that was really an important place to begin, as it turned out. I think because what I realized was that there was no automatic interest in my material. Lots of people are interested already in the Egyptians or in Renaissance painting, but if I was going to intrigue, to entertain around medals, I had to be their champion. I had to start telling their stories in ways that were more engaging, and I had to stop simply assuming the importance of these things. And curatorship, I think, has changed very much in the 32 years that I've been working in museums, from that backroom boy, as it would have been, and it were almost mostly boys in the past, studying particular areas with enormous attention and interest. So on my first day at the British Museum, back in 1991, I was introduced to the extraordinary curator of cuneiform tablets. And I said, well, what do you do? And he said, I take down a tablet, I transcribe it, I translate it, and then I said, and then what? He said, I put it back. And at that point, I realized I need to be something slightly different from this. And actually, he's a very good communicator, so I think he was teasing me. But anyway, so that's where that habit of saying museums are not just passive institutions, they're not just research institutions, they're places where genuine engagement is possible.
True. I think it's you're walking through the corridor of time. You're sort of seeing these very distant ideas come alive in the form of very tangible remnants. But you talk about how there is an interest that people innately have in Egypt or Renaissance, and maybe they are sort of biased towards paintings or sculptures. But as a curator, you have to work with all sorts of material. So there is a backstory that you need to provide. Do you think it's the story, it's the context, that this is not just a coin, it's a manifestation of an entire society, polity, and economy of the period that it comes from?
I think that's absolutely right. It's a very delicate balancing act between finding ways of persuading people to look really hard at what they're seeing and to use this as a way of understanding the visual culture of a particular moment, but then understanding that visual culture didn't operate autonomously, that it's part of much broader discussions or impulses around power, around money, around sex, around all sorts of things that are embedded, sometimes very complicatedly, in these objects.
Yes. And about curation, I mean, I do not want to put you in a spot here, but has there been a moment where you've seen a certain painting and you think to yourself, oh, this is exactly how I want it to be displayed. This is how I want people to perceive it when they walk through a museum. And if there is a particular painting that you want to speak about.
It's a very difficult question because one of the joys of being in a museum is that displays change, and that every new context that you give to a work provides a different opportunity to understand it in different company, the company of different pictures or whatever it might be. I suppose that that those moments where you have seduced somebody into stopping, because we have to remember that for many visitors, they're coming to see an enormous number of objects. They have little time. They may be a one-time visitor to these institutions. So to get them to pause and stop is a real trick. And so, what you decide to put on the vista in a gallery, what's drawing people towards something, what the journey is really can be really, really important. I suppose that the best example I can think of is the way that Piero della Francesca's Baptism of Christ lived in its own chapel in the Sainsbury Wing at the National Gallery and became the destination for the whole journey through the rest of those galleries. A lure because of it's so famous, but also given a kind of a physical context that helped people understand its specialness, but also its religiosity.
True. I do think that, yes, of course, curation and the way in which a particular thing is displayed, including the lighting, including the tabs, everything, with the works, that draws you in. But there are also these works that are just, known to be famous, or that these are supposed to be famous. And when a tourist, for example, goes to a museum in another country, they think, oh, this is the artwork that I want to see. So in those moments, how do you sort of tell them that there are these other artworks that you must also see?
Again, it's very difficult, but I think a museum that has such objects is a lucky one because it's bringing people to those institutions. And to some degree, you have to recognise and be relaxed about the fact that that they'll have an hour, they want to see 10 amazing things. I do often talk about this as a way of a form of seduction, and I think the key thing is often about rhythm. And about lighting, as you say, but the key thing, but for me, the most crucial thing of all is rhythm. So if you create space around a particular object, and it can be something that is celebrated or absolutely not, then people will pause. If you've lit it beautifully enough, if you've made sure that you're not drowning it with words in terms of too many labels, if you give it the chance to perform its spectacle, if I can put it like that. Yeah.
And we are fortunate because the way you have curated things across museums have made many people pause and think and reflect. So let's speak a bit about a moment that was a major learning arc for you, a transformational episode perhaps. Maybe if you would like to speak about bringing back that iconic painting or displaying that iconic painting of Madonna.
So one of my tasks when I first arrived at the National Gallery, and that was about a decade into my career, was a big campaign to keep Raphael's Madonna of the Pinks in Britain. It had been purchased by the Getty Museum, sold by the Duke of Northumberland, rediscovered by one of my predecessors at the National Gallery, and it was hugely expensive. I mean, millions and millions of pounds. It felt like a very quixotic campaign, and when I first got there, there was a big sign over it which said "Save the Raphael," and I stood there with a Getty curator friend, and she said, "What do they think we're going to do? Burn it?" And so I realised that this rhetoric of rescue was not the key thing. That the key thing was to demonstrate that this picture could speak to visitors, whether they cared about Raphael or not. And what we did was to use it as the basis of a series of workshops with young mothers, 14, 15, 16-year-old mothers, to think about the experience of maternity, of what it is to look after a child. And that was to demonstrate to the Heritage Glossary Fund at that point that this picture spoke powerfully to people who were not necessarily invested in the story of the Italian Renaissance. And to begin with, I thought, I wonder if this is going to work, and I wonder what I'm going to learn from this process. But the thing that was crucial, as I discovered, was to listen to your audience, whoever it is. And there was a moment in a class where one of the mothers said, "Well, I think baby Jesus must be about 9 months old. And I don't have children." And I said, "Well, how do you know?" And she said, "Because he's sitting up under his own strength, and Mary is just propping him up with the inside of her wrist. So she's just giving him enough support in case he falls over." And I thought, wow, how amazing that Raphael observed that with that human attention that you might otherwise not expect. And secondly, I've learned something now from that interaction with one of our visitors, with one of our constituency, one of our audiences, that I would never have learned in a traditional art historical narrative.
You know, that's fantastic. And it goes back to a point of being not these passive participants in the process of viewing or appreciating. I mean, when you look at a painting and you truly immerse yourself in it, then the painting has ras, which is flavor, but you are a rasika. You are the one who can appreciate it, and therefore you need to find meaning and resonate. So that's fantastic. But see, Luke, the process of going to the museum is, of course, vital. But there is, of course, a difference in the way in which museums are set up across the world. And there is also the question of access. Mm-hmm. There is also the idea that there are certain, there's the debate on repatriation has been going on for a while. But the idea that there are objects that you would like to see, but they're kept in museums across the world. Now museums have started digitalizing numerous artworks and putting them in the public domain. These are high-resolution images. Of course, nothing can do justice to, going to the museum and viewing something. But what are your thoughts on this process, this digitalization of art and putting it in the public domain for the world to see?
Well, I think it's one of the most magnificent developments that has become available to museums, and to be able to democratize collections in that way, but also, frankly, make accessible objects that otherwise might be in storerooms and available only for specialist scholars, complicated appointments, etc., feels like a crucial thing. I think that the important part, though, is that we haven't yet worked out how to do more than make them available. So I think there are whole ranges of ways in which we can use the digital to start telling stories, and more to the point, to, again, as I said before, invite participation in a way that we haven't done yet. So many museum websites, including that of the Fitzwilliam, attempt in a way to reproduce the experience of visiting the museum in a rather sort of inadequate way. What we don't do always is say, okay, so here we now have an incredible tool for visual analysis. We have the capacity to do things like they do on Netflix. If you like this, you might like that. You have no way of being able to, we're not yet working out a way of linking the kind of great immersive spectacle that the digital can offer with the scholarly. And so I feel that we've been doing this kind of opening up, but it's more than anything. It's almost as if we're just displaying the objects on our storeroom tables. Yes. Now we need to do something more active, more energetic with this technology that can take things forward. And I suspect, and in fact I know, that in my late 50s I'm not the person who's going to be leading the way on this. And that's where making sure that a younger generation of curator. And I do think it's a curatorial process. It can't be simply handed over to digital experts. That's where that becomes so crucial.
Absolutely, because digital experts work on perhaps recognizing patterns, but not necessarily stories.
Exactly.
So if you look at a certain painting and they think that there is another painting that looks like it has the same technique. So there are certain apps that say, well, this painting, if you like this, you might like that. And there are also certain apps wherein if you put your photo, they'll say, these are people from history that you look like, and they'll give you some 10 portraits from across the world.
Gosh.
But this is recognition. This is because your face is constantly being recognized. It's not a curatorial process, because a curator will let you know if you like this story, you will also like the other one, right? So one of the places that has digitalized art is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where you have had your own history. But on the question of Met, what I want to actually ask you is something that speaks to people every year in May, if I'm not wrong.
The first Monday in May.
The first Monday of May, where quite literally the night at the museum transforms for the world into the Met Gala. And I would like to know, what are your thoughts on this evening of celebrity and the glitterati coming to the steps of an institution like Met and celebrating this gala?
So I think it's very important to say, first of all, in my most diplomatic mode, that the Met Gala has brought an enormous amount of cash into the museum, which has supported the Costume Institute over a period of time and allowed them to stage a sequence of extraordinary exhibitions, like the Alexander McQueen show that was one of the great hits of the last decade. So from that point of view, I think it's really crucial. If I can be a little bit more undiplomatic for a second, I would say that there are two potential problems with it. One is that I've discovered, just talking to, my niece and nephews or friends of that kind, that people don't necessarily associate the Met Gala with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. All you see are these steps, after all. So what happens inside is not necessarily the main message. And I think the second, which is perhaps more problematic still, is that it sends a message to the world that museums are elite organizations, that it's the people, it's a kind of red carpet experience in a way, and that what's exciting is culture that's produced for the very rich. So for haute couture, rather than necessarily the kind of pottery, say, that almost all civilizations used across time. And I think the Met does many other things, by the way, that balances that. But if that becomes the main message and the main way in which a museum is known, then that's a problem. As I say, I think that there are lots of initiatives that are going on at the Metropolitan Museum which balance that. But I think there was a period, perhaps, when this just kind of blurred the message of what the whole museum was about.
Yes. No, it's interesting that you mention how it sort of looks at a very elite way of visiting the museum. But I would also like to then ask, and this is the last segment of this episode, what about the historical narrative in itself too? For how long do you think it has excluded certain histories and made it feel like that these voices have not existed, be it of women, be it of people from the LGBTQI community? So how many times is it that you go to a museum and you look at a painting or a sculpture and you think, well, this is not my story. And if they're not my stories around here, why must I come to a place where I feel so alien? What are your thoughts on that? And where are we going?
It's the big question we're all discussing and all thinking about. I think many institutions are arriving at different solutions. But if I can answer it a little bit personally to begin with, and maybe just go back to the story of fashion. One of the things that, as a gay man, I found worrying in the past is not just that there hasn't been a curation of objects that chooses to focus on who I am from that point of view, but that when you see exhibitions about fashion designers or about painters like Sargent, for example, or some of the great early impressionists, then that part of them isn't acknowledged. And I will say, that I think to some degree I've been guilty of that in terms of that normative mode. When I did an exhibition on Leonardo da Vinci at the National Gallery, we didn't talk about his sexuality at all. And in fact, I remember my one mention of it in the catalogue was queried by the editor, queried perhaps being the right word. And I had to fight to leave it in, which was a very strange thing. This is only back in 2011 or thereabouts. When I came to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, I discovered that we had the portraits, the mid-17th century portraits of a couple, a male couple, who had met at Cambridge and had spent their entire lives together, Finch and Baines. And they had taken ambassadorial roles, and one of them had taken them to Florence, where they were painted by Carlo Dolci. Only one of those pictures was hanging at the time when I arrived. And as we looked at this, I thought, this is the first opportunity I've had to put my own narrative to some degree on the walls of a museum. And this really triggered something enormous, in a sense, in my head, of understanding properly for the first time how left out I'd felt. It wasn't a damaging feeling, but it was just a sort of a gap, and that there was so much one could do to first of all examine different histories, and that allowed people to recognise themselves better in institutions like the Fitzwilliam and other museums. Not to stop telling the old stories, but to add to them. That's the key to my mind. You know, there's a lot of anxiety that museums are now focusing on the stories of people of colour, on the whole stories of in Britain at least of the colonial adventure and of the dreadful history of enslavement and the profiting from it. Oddly, this seems to upset people. To my mind, it's just another form of historical analysis, but it's one that demonstrates that these histories are shared. That the presence of women artists or of black writers and abolitionists, people who were leading resistance rather than passively agreeing to it, are stories we can tell, and that they're enriching, they're empowering, and I think they're important to do that. And it's not sacrificing anything; it's simply complicating it and rendering it more complete.
Absolutely, and complicated is the story of humanity, of our history. We are very multifaceted, checkered people, and it is only when we are the most complicated that it does justice to our equally multi-layered story.
Well, and I think that, so Finch and Baines, they were buried together in a Cambridge college. The tomb talks about their relationship as a marriage, which admitted no argument throughout their lives. But if one were to quiz, for example, their attitudes in Istanbul, where one of them was posted to race, I suspect that one would find an actually completely archetypal Anglo attitude to the other at that moment. We have a bust of Antinous, Hadrian's lover, that arrived in England from the Villa Tivoli in the late 18th century. By the time it came to the Fitzwilliam, it was bequeathed by Charles Ricketts and Charles Shannon. So again, a male couple who had bought it, I suspect, especially as a monument to this idea of Greek love, which in Britain at that moment justified a number of different kinds of relationships in which power wasn't always equal. I think it's important, again, in celebrating Ricketts and Shannon or the love between Antinous and Hadrian, to remember that these stories are not uncomplicated themselves, and that, in Cambridge at least, the arrival of a bust like that would have confirmed the value of a bachelor culture, of a predominantly male culture, in a university which didn't allow women to take degrees until after the Second World War. So, it's part of, and where one of Ricketts and Shannon's circle, Oscar Browning, is taken up as the example of male sort of superiority complex by Virginia Woolf in A Room of One's Own. I'm pleased to say at the Fitzwilliam we also have the draft for that seminal work. So there's a balance within a museum about how you can tell these different stories and how they can engage different parts of our histories, celebratory certainly, but also revelatory of that shared complexity that we've all inherited.
Yes, no, celebration and revelation. I think that's a very important point, because yet again, if you just celebrate, you're reducing that identity to their entire being, their entire personality. But it is when we complicate the story that the story becomes fair. And Luke, Thank you so much. This has been deeply enriching. I absolutely love speaking with you. And I think that as we keep on going, keep on curating, we'll keep on telling stories to make the world a better place and to unite us. So
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who tuned into this episode of Jaipur Bytes. Thank you.